So it's been just over 2 years since I took novice ordination. And also, Venerable Chodron is starting to teach on the section in the Following the Buddhist Footsteps on ethical conduct. So the role of precepts has been on my mind. So I wanted to talk about that and how precepts have really impacted my life. And there were two really helpful analogies that I've heard about that I want to explore through this BBC. So first is I've heard it said that the lower section of our shimdop, or our lower robe, represents like a fence. And this is representing the minor precepts that prevent us from breaking more of the major precepts. So those are for the full ordination precepts. And so I started thinking about this in terms of a pasture, how the precepts are really like fences, and that throughout my study and practice of Dharma, I've taken more and more precepts. And so I was thinking about how that relates to how my pasture is getting smaller. And maybe even a pasture is turning into a corral. So first, you could say, and this is a very rough analogy, that I was free range, that I didn't actually have any boundaries, especially during this time in my life. After I had set down Christianity, this was during college, and before I had met the Buddha Dharma, there was a time where you could say I went a bit wild. I didn't really have a boundary on my ethics, or I didn't really have ethics. So I was able to do whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted, however I wanted, and I could go anywhere I wanted. And just to see, like, is this bringing me happiness? Clearly it was not, and it also created a lot of harm to myself and others. Then when I met the Dharma, and then eventually took refuge in the 5 lay precepts, then it was a little bit smaller of a pasture. I had some boundaries for my ethics. The biggest boundary, I think, and the ones that made the most impact on my life, especially my social life, was the 3rd and the 5th of the 5 lay precepts. So that the 3rd, to not engage in unwise or unkind sexual behavior, and also the 5th, not to take intoxicants. So this was a really big shift in my behavior. And of course, like we all know, it changes your group of friends, it changes what you do. So this was really helpful. So I could see that having a much larger scope or range of behavior in terms of drinking and using sexual behavior in an unwise, unkind way was really harmful. And so I was really happy to have that smaller container, that fence of the 5 lay precepts. And so then going on to take the 8 anagarika precepts. So that adds precepts that really start to change your behavior in significant ways. And really, there's still lay precepts, but really limit your behavior, like so no entertainment. So that's a really big departure from what I was engaged in prior to that, or not eating after midday, for example. So I saw this as really kind of the transition from where you can live in lay society in a city with the 5 lay precepts pretty easily, but I found going to the 8 precepts, it's really helpful to have a container, a monastic container, ideally, to have a place where you can hold those precepts. Because if not, you'll have to be really, really careful and really check your mind in terms of how you're engaging with music and entertainment and all of that, and food. So that, again, was a smaller pasture. And then taking novice ordination, it's even a smaller pasture. So it adds another precept around not handling money. So again, this is also would be very difficult, not living in a monastic environment. And so with each of these, I found that I could reflect on, okay, how does this smaller range of behavior, of body and speech, benefit me? And how did those behaviors that are outside of this new container, how were those harmful to myself and others? So to really see that, yeah, this is really helpful to have a smaller range of behavior. And so then, full ordination, which I have not taken yet, but aspire to do so. So again, this is even a smaller corral, you could say, or pasture in which to operate in the world, taking on many, many more precepts. But for this, I wanted to say a quote coming from the Pratimoksha Sutra that Lama Tsongkhapa quotes in the middle length Lam Rim. And this is actually in the section on the qualities of a teacher, that they have restrained their body and speech through the pratimoksha. But I found this analogy to be, it's very graphic, but for my mind, it's very helpful. So it says, in accord with the unruly horse of the mind, always straining to run away, a bridle studded with 100 sharp nails, that is the pratimoksha vows, which I want to take. So this image of a bridle, so I basically knew what a bridle was, but I wanted to look it up to see sort of exactly what it was. So it's basically the harness that goes on the head of a horse that has reins up to the rider, and the rider can pull the reins to adjust where the head is. There are some bridles that have a bit go in your mouth, that go in the horse's mouth. And this is either a chain or a bar, like a metal bar. But then there's some new bridles that are more comfortable that don't have a bit. So they just have, leather straps around the head. So I really enjoy this analogy because how I've experienced the precepts just in these past 2 years is that when I'm very afflicted, when I have an afflicted mind, then every precept is like a nail. It's very painful. And why is that? Because I'm resisting, because I want to do something else. Attachment or anger wants to do something else besides what the precepts are dictating. And so it's that resistance that creates the pain. It's not the precepts themselves. But when my mind is calm and peaceful and I'm content in my environment, then the precepts are very comfortable. I'm able to operate in the world within the precepts in a happy way. And also to remember that we choose, right, to have these smaller and smaller containers of ethical conduct because we see their benefit. And in terms of the bridle of the pratimoksha vows, then we choose to put on that bridle. Why? Because it is really helpful to start to tame our body and speech. And by extension, to tame the mind, right? Because we can't tame our body and speech if we don't tame the mind. So to really see that when I'm not living with precepts, then I create more harm, I create negative karma, and basically I have more suffering. And so these precepts, I've seen this gradual progression of more and more precepts really protect me from all of that. And so the task really, how I've seen, is how can I become more and more comfortable in this smaller pasture that I have, now living in a monastic container, in a monastic community. And so that's where I am now, is, okay, how can I find joy within this container? And so I wanted to read one quote from Following in the Buddha's Footsteps. And Venerable will get to this soon. But it's related to how limits of ethical conduct really help us to cultivate contentment. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Venerable Chodron write, how does this practice of having limits create contentment? Contentment is an internal feeling that arises when craving is absent. As we practice releasing our craving and being satisfied with the present situation, contentment naturally arises. From our own experience, we learn that contentment comes not from having our desires fulfilled, but from freeing ourselves from being under the control of those desires. So I've really seen that as I've taken these levels of precepts, that then it becomes my practice to how can I find content within this? How can I become satisfied with the more limited experiences that are dictated by the precepts? And also, they also write, the meaning of mental advancement is that untamed states of mind decrease and beneficial states increase. So this is what we're aiming to do. And like I said, the way to tame the mind is first taming the body and speech, because when we tame the body and speech, then if our mind is not tamed, and I've done this, so I know this from personal experience, you can follow the precepts literally, but be completely miserable and not understand why you're doing what you're doing. But when you train your mind and tame your mind in conjunction, in tandem with taming the body and speech, then there's mental development and you're happier. So I've really seen how, taking these precepts, keeping them, has really helped to discipline this very unruly horse of the mind. And that these corrals, these fenced-in pastures, they're not imprisoning. They're actually liberating. And this bridal, with all of its nails, is not this weird torture device that we put on to torture ourselves, but rather it's to really tame ourselves fully. Because when we're able to have happiness while keeping the precepts, then I think we've really, we've deepened our conviction that happiness comes from within. And so I see that all of these precepts are directing me again and again. Happiness isn't out there. That's why you've chosen to live within this fence. Happiness isn't out there. That's why you're living in this tighter and tighter container. So I really have growing conviction that this does lead to greater happiness than to let my mind run wild. Because I've done that and I've seen that's not beneficial to myself or others. So let's, with a very joyful mind, work to tame our body, speech, and mind for the benefit of all beings.